the next 20 minutes. To promote and preserve the legacy of Dr. Cheddi Jagan, who was a founder member and the leader of the People's Progressive Party. The PPP, as we know, was formed on January the 1st, 1950, and is today the oldest and largest political party in Guyana. And I would say one of the first mass-based political party, mass-based and I would say multiracial political party to have been formed in Guyana. Prior to the formation of the PPP, there was the Political Affairs Committee, shortened form PAC, founded in 1946. The founder members of the PAC were Dr. Cheddi Jagan, his wife Janet, 8 J.M. Hubbard, and Aston Chase. The PAC can be considered as the forerunner of the PPP. To speak on the subject, we have two stalwarts of the People's Progressive Party, Comrade Donald Ramotar, who needs no introduction, former president, general secretary, and long-standing member of the party. And next to him is Comrade Clement Rohee, who also served as the general secretary of the People's Progressive Party and held other important capacities in the government, including a minister of cabinet. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. And I would now invite Clement Rohee to give some of his initial thoughts as we reflect on the 73 years of the formation of the People's Progressive Party. Clement Rohee.
Thank you. I'm very happy that CGRC was able to initiate programs like this via Zoom. I'd like to extend congratulations to CGRC and of course to welcome the viewers at the same time. Now, I would like to begin my contribution by discussing the question of the character of the People's Progressive Party. Because many times the character of the People's Progressive Party is misunderstood, or I could say misinterpreted, and sometimes put out of context by what I would describe as PPP watchers, who claim to have or claim to be experts on the PPP and Guyanese politics, when in fact they, with respect to their views, which they're entitled to, do not have a very deep, I would say, and profound understanding of what the character or the main characteristics of the PPP is or are. One of the first things I observed in reading about the People's Progressive Party, following the activities of the People's Progressive Party from its inception. And I'd like to make a point from the very beginning, which is that the name Cheddi, Jagan, and the PPP are inextricably bound up. In other words, you can't, or we should not, attempt to separate Cheddi Jagan and to a large extent Janet Jagan from the People Progressive Party. The three are inseparable. But when Dr. Jagan started out as a lone member of the LECHCO, as it was called in those days, what struck me with his politics was his ability to work with his adversaries. Now, in the LECHCO in those days, you have a lot of people who were so-called independents. And you had people who represented the colonial interests, British colonial interests, and the business community. But Cheddi Jagan, even before the formation of the PPP, was able to work with those people in the Legislative Assembly in those days to get certain motions agreed to by all consensually that have to do with the interests of poor people, poverty-related issues. So that when the PPP was formed in 1950, sorry, when the PPP was formed 1st of January 1950, it should not be seen as unusual for the same policy issues, so to speak, to be inserted in the programmatic platform of the PPP. That is to say, issues related to poor people, working people. And that is what was a defining characteristic of the PPP from then onwards. And this is, I think, extremely important because there is a debate that has arisen within recent times as to whether the nature and the characteristics of the PPP has changed. I would like to stop at this point.
Thank you for your initial thoughts. I now invite Commander Ramotar to give us his take.
One of the other characteristics of the PPP is the fact that it has always been an international party, because in some ways it is the product of what was also taking place internationally. You will recall that immediately after the war, the Second World War, and with the victory of the Soviet Red Army, the defeat of Hitlerite fascism, it created very good conditions for the anti-colonial struggles in the world to take place. And you had a lot of victories in 1947. India was the first to become independent, break the chains of colonialism. And that was a difficult struggle that India had, but also very important was the victory of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. China was not a colony as such, but it was a semi-colony. And it broke, China also broke that chain. And there was a lot of enthusiasm in the world that to build a new world without wars, because they had just come out of a big war, without exploitation, without colonies, where everybody would be equal. So PPP has been a product of that struggle from the very beginning, and its very inception is wrote as its goals was, first of all, to win political independence for the people of British Guyana, to be an independent country so that we can make our own decisions and we can move our country forward. But it didn't see that as an end in itself. It saw that as a step towards what is its longer-term aim, which was also to liberate poor people, working people, and give them a voice. And they wrote socialism, that one of the goals of the PPP was to build a socialist society after winning independence. And let me just say about socialism. Socialism is the concept of the class. And this was an idea to give the working class a say in the management of the state, the working people, a say in the management of the state, how the state should run, and to run the interest in the interest of the vast majority of people who are workers and farmers and small business people, and et cetera, et cetera. The other aspect, the other thing that the PPP wrote on its banner was that it will work with the rest of the international community to fight to bring an end to colonialism. And therefore, from the very beginning, international solidarity was one of the foundations of the PPP. And you will see in 1950, 51, there was a big struggle in Grenada, workers struggled in Grenada. And the PPP was probably the only Caribbean country that not only mobilized solidarity and support and public meetings, but also raised funds for Grenada. It also exposed to the Guyanese people that a new life was possible, there was a new possibility to build a country for the majority of the poor people. And therefore it had a lot of solidarity with the USSR, with China, and because China had won the revolution there too and started to construct a new society. With Africa, with Kenya, with the struggle that was going on in Kenya at the time, Kenya in Africa was one of the highest point in the struggle. And if you go back to the early documents, you will see from the very beginning that the PPP was in solidarity and support of South Africa in that fight. So the PPP always saw themselves not only as a political party within Guyana to free the Guyanese people and to get independence and eventually to win socialism, but it also always saw itself as part and parcel of the international struggle against war for peace. And that is why it is very disappointing that nothing much is being said about ending the war with Russia and Ukraine, and the very fact that war should have been avoided. I think that needs to be emphasized more than anything else now, before we end up into a nuclear war. The need to have an end to this war by guaranteeing Russia its peace, and that is the only way that Ukraine too can be guaranteed its security as well.
Oh, thank you for that broad overview. And I'll ask Clement if he can touch on this a little. Before the formation of the PPP, you had the Political Affairs Committee of 1946. But the Political Affairs Committee, as we all know, was not a political party. It was more a pressure group and advocacy group. But what would you say were the main triggers, as it were, that resulted in the formation of the PPP in 1950?
What I think, to answer that question, which is an extremely important one, is that with the formation, but the PSC was a harbinger of the PPP. PSC was the harbinger of the PPP. So that if you look at the key players in the PAC, you would see that many of them transitioned to the People's Progressive Party when it was formed in 1950. But it was even broader, membership, even broad base. And in terms of the social composition of the People's Progressive Party at the time, it was really national in terms of its class representation, social strata, etc. But what, apart from the individuals who, of course, stood out in those days, like Cheddi Jagan, Janet Jagan, Ashton Chase, Jocelyn Hubbard, Ram Karan, and others, what stood out? And here again was another key element in the characteristic of the People's Progressive Party, flowing from the PAC into the PPP, is the question of firmness on issues of principle, but flexibility. So those two trends have been ever present in the long history of the 73 years of the PPP, from beginning 50 to, I would say, even to present day, and we will come to analyze that in the context of what is happening today. The main fact that the social composition of the party was broad-based, and because it was also focused on the question of national independence, there was no need for a particular social strata to be the more dominant strata in the PPP. So even if the members in the PAC were Marxist or socialist oriented, so to speak, some of these people call them communists, and they then being key players in the PPP, the fact that the party was fighting for national independence meant that that struggle had to be broad-based, because the struggle for national independence ought not to involve a particular strata, but be broad-based. Because national independence calls for the involvement of as many representatives of social classes as possible. Even what we call, in orthodox terms, the national bourgeoisie or the national capitalist class. And so the element of firmness on question of principle, like the question of independence, and Donald made the point about independence struggles in many countries. Only the other day I saw an Al Jazeera documentary on the struggle of the Mau Mau in Kenya. And I remembered, and in fact, if you read the Western Trial, you will see Cheddi Jagan referring to the Mau Mau struggle in India, the Huk Balahap in the Philippines, and many other colonies who were fighting for independence. So what I like about the formation of the PPP throughout its lifetime, the present, is the question of its flexibility and to involve as many representatives of the different social strata and classes in society, because we talk about a national democracy. And we don't speak about a national democracy in abstraction as something out there without any meaning. We talk about a national democracy. This country is still a developing country. And therefore it requires the involvement of different representatives of social strata, social classes, to build whatever the manifestos of the PPP over those years called for.
Well, there were also economic issues in the Caribbean at that time. The Great Depression had impacted terribly on the conditions of life of the people of the colonies. In his book, A Warning from the West Indies, one writer, W.N. Macmillan, stated that any socio-economic study of the West Indies is, in quote, necessarily a study of poverty.
But that was one of the characteristics of colonialism as a whole, not only the Caribbean, but in the whole colonial world. You had that. But I think the formation of the PPP also reflects the PAC, the founders of the PAC, the fact that they were all Marxists, and I think they had a direction that they were following. They saw the necessity of preparing the ground for a political party, and therefore the PAC was very important. The PAC was not only fighting, some of its main tasks was to educate the population. In fact, it said so in its beginning document, was to educate the population, give them information, and towards the end of forming a political party. They had that as one of their goals. And And I think they saw it as they were very clear that a political party to lead the country to socialism had to be a stronger party. But at the stage where they were at, they were not. That was not the main ground. The main ground was winning independence, and therefore they needed a broad organization with all classes and formations in it. The main criteria is that they would be anti-colonial, they would want independence and so forth. So that is what I believe, and it was also the struggle in Guyana that accelerated things. I think things moved very, very quickly because there were some major strikes in 1948 in Guyana. You had the strike in the transport workers union, had a big strike in what was known as the tear strike, where trade unionists like Ramparand and Polydor and Edwards and others came to the fore. You had a big strike in the bauxite industry at the same time, a very big strike there too, and also was calling about the kind of apartheid that existed in Mackenzie, where at Watuka you had the white people living on the hills and the natives at the ground, at the valleys. And then the big strike in the sugar industry in 1948, and more sugar strike, in which that heightened, I think, the political consciousness of the people more than anything else. And it really put independence on the agenda and the creation of a party. The PPP was formed from a resolution from the PAC group in Buxton and another one in Kitty that passed a resolution that the time to form the People's Progressive Party. And that's why in 1950, it was decided to form the party in January 4th, 1950.
Thank you. And that's very useful information. A lot of people don't know that the party was formed on the basis of PAC resolution. I am hearing that.
Yeah, two groups, Buxton and Kitty.
Okay.
But now you mentioned this economic issue.
Yes.
And you're correct. In fact, the resolution, PSC resolution, and the first manifesto of the PPP raised this question of economic independence, political independence, and the leaders at the time saw the interconnection and interaction between politics and economics. As Cheddi used to say, politics is a concentrated form of economics. Now, and what I found interesting as you read the history of the PPP was that coming back to the question I raised earlier, the PPP always recognized that there was a space for the local capitalist class. What do I mean by this? I mean that under colonialism, the economy was dominated by foreign capital. You had the Bookers, the Sandwich Parkers, and all these companies. And then you had the Portuguese, who were the dominant business class in the country. What the PPP did in 1953, the 125 days, 133 days in office, you could see where it sought to reflect the interests of the local capitalist class, because the party recognized that for the country to grow, you had to have a local capitalist class develop. Not only foreign capital, but local capital as well. So they sought to create what we could describe as industrial bourgeoisie or local industrial capitalists. And that is what resulted in the creation of the industrial estates at Rhineville.
Yes.
That was established in order to facilitate the development of the local capitalist class in the country and to sort of compete with foreign capital. And those other interests who were the dominant capitalist class in Guyana. Now, I emphasize this because when we talk about the communist PPP, and when some talk about the communist label and seek to situate the PPP solely in an ideological context, they do not recognize that here was a party that had its own brand of socialism, its own brand of how it saw the evolvement or the evolution of society, that it had to take place with the interests of the agricultural workers, the farmers. Ramotar mentioned the more market thing, the cane cutters, cane farmers, etc. And so encouraging big rice farmers and giving land also to small farmers in the rice industry and representing the agricultural workers in the sugar industry was reflective of the PPP's position on the importance of agriculture in this country. In other words, agriculture had to be the backbone of the economy. But it also linked agriculture to the industrial development of the country. And that is why these industrial estate, this industrial estate at Rhineville was created to harmoniously blend with agricultural development in the country. Now, the creation of the industrial estates was critical for the country to move forward. And nowadays, when you speak to many of the beneficiaries of industry that were created as a result of the establishment of the Rhineville Industrial Estate, you hear some interesting stories. You hear some interesting stories whereby small businessmen, in this small local businessmen, right, were not allowed, were so fenced in by the dominance of foreign capital and the Portuguese, so to speak. And I'm not labeling or branding anybody here. Let me make that clear. I'm just talking about what was the reality in those days, that the Indian businessmen were not allowed to grow. That was a reality. But with the formation or the establishment of the industrial estate, what did we see? We saw the SK Puri with the continental agencies, but paint, manufacturing of paint and paint products. We saw kissues, furniture, and many other industries began to develop. And that put them in a good position to compete with the other business class that was dominating the economy at the time.
Good. Good. Thank you. Thank you. Donald, the PPP in 1953 won a landslide victory after just 3 years of the formation of the PPP. I think this is a very unprecedented political development in the region as a whole. A party coming just 3 years or less in office was able to win a landslide victory. What would you say were the reasons why the PPP was able to win such a big victory, even though it was just in its fledgling years as a political party?
I think in the first place, it was a reflection of the condition that existed in the country and the poverty of a lot of the working people were living in, workers and farmers. And that's on the objective side. On the subjective side, I think it reflects the work that the PPP did from the PAC days right down to 1953, that they were able to lift the awareness of people to such an extent that they began to see things in a different light. You gotta understand what the PPP confronted from an ideological point of view. I still remember I was born during the colonial period myself. I still remember singing "Long May She Reign Over Us, God Save the Queen," and "Rule Britannia Rule," and all of these things. So the PPP, it reflected how far the party was able to break the chain, that mental chain that had oppressed the people of our country, and to get people to see that we were capable, that Guyanese were capable of managing their own affairs. And I think that is what the massive victory in 1953 it reflected of that period of what was happening. It was also, in my view, a miscalculation on the point of the British. I don't think that they had expected that the PPP would have won the elections. Otherwise, I don't think they would have given the universal adult suffrage. The PPP itself was surprised at the victory that they had. I say that because you know that immediately after the victory, there was a big problem within the party itself. The leadership struggle began within the party itself at that time. And I was saying that if the PPP had expected that they would have won the election, that struggle would have taken place before the elections and not after the elections. So it reflected that it was probably the PPP realized that it would do well, but they didn't expect that they would have won the massive victory that it won. The other thing too is that the PPP was completely different from the rest of the Caribbean political parties. The main political party in the Caribbean at the time was in Jamaica. They had gone up probably further than the rest of the region, but then the PPP came, but they were more like a middle-class group fighting for a say at the table, while the PPP had a vision of removing the system as a whole and putting working people in authority so that they will have a say in their life, they will have a say in their work, how the work was being done, and generally in the life of the country. That was the main difference with the PPP and the rest of the Caribbean. And I think also the distinction also could be looked at probably in education as well. Because if you look at the regional leaders at the time, those who were most of them were educated in Britain. And Britain had a policy of educating the colonials to be colonials and to be loyal to Britain itself. Dr. Jagan had his education in the United States. And at that time, the United States was very anti-colonial. It had, the United States had a revolutionary history. And it was probably at the bottom point of their revolutionary, but they were very anti-colonial. And they encouraged fight against colonialism and what have you. And that is where I think there's one of the main difference. The other difference, I believe, is that if you look at the Caribbean, the leadership of the political parties in the Caribbean, they were all professional people, lawyers, doctors, and professors, and mathematicians, and so forth. The PPP mobilized. They were able to capture the best minds in the country, the intellectual class. But the intellectual class in British Guyana at that time was different from the rest of the people. It was not people who were very far away from the worker, teachers. Sidney King was a teacher. Ram Karan was a worker, a clerk in the railway. A lot of Edwards, all of them worked. So it was people who were, I would call them self-educated, but who had not only were able not only as workers themselves, they were able to grasp a pitch or the message that the PAC had sent out. They were able to grasp that, and they formed a very smart charter. That these were not people who went to university, but these are all people, a kind of a indigenous type of intellectual class that was not trained in the universities of the British. And that is why I think they had a more radical position about changing their life and putting working people in authority to have a say in their own lives.
Well, the PPP only lasted for 6 months, 123 days, in the first ever electoral victory of 1953. But you had mentioned that the PPP had, from its very beginning, embraced a socialist concept. Would you say that part of the reason why the PPP was overthrown or why the Constitution was suspended just 6 months after the PPP came in office, do you think it had anything to do with the radicalism you spoke about and this leftist orientation of the PPP?
No, I think it was more the fear of Britain that they didn't want to lose their colonies. Britain was not ready to give up its colonies at that point in time. You recall that when after the war, Winston Churchill made the famous statement, he was referring to India, to say that, and this was when 1946, 47, I was not elected prime minister to preside over the destruction of the colonial system, So they were not ready to give up their position, because nothing that the PPP did in the 1953 government could have been described as communistic. One of the bills that they passed, which people felt that was probably the main one that they wanted to get rid of, was the labor relation bill, which was more of a democratic bill, and which was patterned after the Wagner Act in the United States. And this was to give workers the opportunity to elect a trade union, to be represented by trade union of their choice, and which was more of a democratic, had nothing to do with socialism there. It was just a democratic system. And I think because the PPP itself had the experience, or many people in the PPP, particularly those who were close to the sugar industry, had the experience of company unionism, where the trade union became an instrument of the company among the workers instead of representing the workers, that they wanted to ensure that should not happen in any sector of the Guyanese society, and to give the workers the right to elect their leaders. That was probably the most radical of the bills that they had put forward, but that was a bill that was functioning in the United States, and it was a practice in the United Kingdom at the time. So I would say that it was more, while it is framed as that the PPP was overthrown because of communism, I think communism was a red herring. If you know that communism was used at that time to attack the liberation fighters in Yemen, it was used in Greece, it was used in everywhere to try to prevent colonialism from it. It was used in Kenya. The Mau people were being described as communists. It was used in South Africa against Mandela, although that Mandela was no communist and so forth at that time.
Well, Clement, you mentioned earlier about Dr. Jagan and the PPP as a developmentalist. He had done a lot of developmental projects in Guyana to weaken the influence, as it were, of foreign capital in the country itself. But before I go to that, 1957 period, when Dr. Jagan won the election again, after the suspension of the Constitution, something had happened. I just want to indulge me here a little. Something had happened that had a terrible consequence in this country, and that was the split of the PPP in 1955, just 2 years prior to the 1957 election. Is there anything you would like to share with the audience and why this happened? And because for the first time in Guyana, we had that semblance of racial and national unity. What happened? Why is it that this unity was ruptured in 1955?
Well, that's exactly what I want to, to focus on. The PAC helped to foster or germinate, so to speak, this whole question of ethnic unity, working class unity in the country. Because when you look, or when you read the speeches of the leaders at that time, what they were saying either in the Legislative Assembly or otherwise, or even at public meetings, the main focus was on uplifting the living and working conditions of the working people. And the working people at that time, the great majority, the vast majority of the working people at that time were Indian and Black, Afro-Chinese. Now, therefore, it was not surprising when the PPP was created and you looked at the leadership at the time of the PPP, you saw that ethnic blending there as well. And you read about the efforts that Dr. Jagan made to bring in Barnum in the PPP to address this question. Now, some people would say that he tried to address it window dressing, so to speak, for window dressing purposes. But I don't think so, because when you read the literature, you could see the efforts that were made to, and again, it was not simply for optics, it was mainly to do with the politics and the reality that existed at the time. To address that question is in the eyes of the people. So, take the tree. You asked the question about this tremendous victory. It was precisely because there was racial and working class unity in a country named British Guyana, where these two dominant ethnic groups existed, and where the leaders were able to bring them together to work towards a common goal. Notwithstanding the fact that it was short-lived for just a few months. And
6 months.
But when and then during that interregnum, while the Waterton Commission sought to pitch one group against one faction, or to create the impression it was two factions.
Was it the Wellington Constitution or the Robertson Constitution Commission that tried to create it?
No, if Wellington Constitution Wellington did the Constitution for the 53.
But the Robertson Commission.
Robertson did after the suspension.
Right. And that is the commission that.
So that body sought to encourage factions within the PPP. That well, Barnum, look, boy, this man Jagan is a communist. You're not going to get very far with him. Why don't you distance yourself from him and either form a new political party or make statements that appeases the colonial powers in London? Their main task, as I see it, was to divide. Come back to this whole question of divide and rule. They were doing that all over the world. Guyana was no exception in that respect. And the divide and rule tactic was manifested subsequently during that period between the suspension of the Constitution of 55 and 57, when the new Constitution was adopted and elections where the split took place. But even then you had two PPPs, Barnum PPP and a Jagan PPP. And when Barnum lost tremendously, he realized that he had to create his own new PNC party. Now, even though you found that that split took place, and the maneuverings and the underhand activity, the shenanigans that took place between them to split the PPP, In the 57 elections, the PPP still ran home with a great majority.
Yes. I think it was 9 out of the 14 seats.
Good. I think they said they won 54% of the votes, 53 to 54% of the votes. And so, and what was the reason for that? Dr. Jagan explained that the reason why the PPP was still able to win a majority of seats and votes was because the split in the party did not completely assume racial lines. That there was still a lot of African Guyanese who were supportive of the PPP in 1957. You see? So people saw through Borno, as his sister said, beware my brother falls. People saw through what was happening there. And that is why when the Congress that was held at the Charlotte Street, I forgot what was the name of the place.
Empire?
Many
Empire Cinema.
Empire Metropole.
Or Metropole. Metropole.
many of the African Guyanese members of the PPP did not go along with Borno. When he shouted leader or nothing. People saw that as opportunity. But the 57 victory showed that despite the split in the PPP and despite the maneuverings of the colonial powers to marginalize, so to speak, to use a popular word that is now a wrongly placed, the PPP, it still won a majority of 57 and 64.
61.
61, sorry, 1957 and
1964 too, you remember?
Yes.
But Donald,
I think I got a slightly different perspective
please
of that.
give your perspective.
I don't think that anybody had identified Barnum to come into the party because they thought that he would have bridged racial gap or anything like that. Actually, Barnum had played no part in the PAC, the Political Affairs.
No, not in the PAC.
He was recruited by Billy Stratton in the United Kingdom. Billy Stratton was a Jamaican, and he ran an organization called CLC, Caribbean Labor Congress. And he worked with a lot of Caribbean people. A lot of Caribbean people worked with him, and he tried to get them to fight against colonialism. He also recruited, he worked very closely with Ralph Ramperan. He worked with Miles Fitzpatrick. He worked with other people.
He was a member of the Communist Party.
And yes, and it was him who recommended the Cheddi that Barnum, he saw Barnum activities in England and recommended that Barnum should join the party. Cheddi then he brought Barnum in to be at the leadership of the party, at the formation of the party. But the chairmanship of the party, it was this thought it should have gone to Ashton Chase. But Ashton Chase is the one who said that, I think Ashton Chase was also already thinking about going to study law. He liked law. And he was thinking about going to study law. So he was thinking maybe he might need to take some time out. He didn't want to take that responsibility then. And he recommended that Barnum be the chairman of the party. That is how Barnum became chairman of the party. But before the PPP was formed, the racial issue was dealt with more in the middle class level. The working people had no problem with race. It was the middle class who was fighting for their share within the colonial system itself. And you had the League of Colored People, and then you had the British Guyana East Indian Association. And they were all really, it was more of a class thing like that. They started to attack the PPP when the PPP was bringing races together and involving the working people. They didn't want the working people involved in this. They wanted to leave it up there to share the spoil within the middle class section of the people and so forth of the society. So that is one clear thing that the PPP was pushing for racial unity and so forth. The PPP in 1953, race was used against them, but it had no effect. Because that is when Apartheid came in. That was a man by the name of Debadin, who had another political party, and he was the one who first used that slogan, which PNC skillfully turned against the PPP in the 60s and so forth. And the blacks were attacking Barnum to say that he was selling out black people to the Indian people, and the Indians were attacking Cheddi, saying doing the same thing in the opposite direction. But it didn't have no impact because the concentration that the PPP had focused on was on working people and not on necessarily the middle class level of people and so forth. So that is why I think that the PPP won. When you look at the elections, as you rightly said, the PPP won at Mackenzie in 1957, the election that you were speaking about. It was this fellow, Bowman, Fred Bowman, who was a PPP member that won Mackenzie seat, the Upper Demerara seat. Well, won by the PPP. The PNC only got that in 61 when they started to do the racial issues and so forth. So the racial issue had its beginning, I believe. I think I am of the view that a lot of people who talk about the racial problem in Guyana, they got it totally wrong. Many of them say that the racial problem in Guyana started when Indians came here, but that is totally not true. Said on the button network, that is not true either, because if you look, how many sugar estates closed down because of the lack of labor at the time that existed at the time. Since then, that happened. And if you look, they had never had any problem with Indians and blacks, Indians and Africans throughout that period. In fact, Indians, they were reaching out and trying instinctively to reach out to other workers on the East Bank, trying to join the workers in Tongue under Critchlow, and many other people. They even call Critchlow Black Cosby. So this thing was prepared over a number of years, particularly after the split, by the media, which was controlled, the British media controlled by the local big business and the colonial state, the constant sting of the media. And Barnum used it in order to get some type of popularity. And that is why I will say that the PNC has never been, was not, and is not now a national party. The PNC was formed as a party to stop independence from coming to the country, to destroy the liberation movement. And it remains an obstructive party to this very day.
Well, Hyday, my main question is this. This matter has been with us since those days, and it's with us up to now. Before I develop that point, the PPP is a very unique party, very unique. When you look at the political parties that emerged almost at the same time with the PPP, in Barbados, in Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. The PPP is unique in the sense that, notwithstanding all the difficulties, the trials and tribulations it went through, it was able to maintain political power, to return to political power. After much bashing, ideologically, politically, economically, etc., it was able to return to power in 1992. Well, of course, 53, 135 days, 57, 61, 64, I would argue, because it was the British who overthrew the PPP.
The PPP won the largest block of votes, 47, near 48%.
And then in 1992, well, I mean, we could debate the whole question of rigged elections during that period from
68 to 92.
To 92.
There's nothing to debate there.
No, a debate in the sense that the PPP has always argued, let's look at it from the PPP. The PPP has always argued that were those elections not rigged, it would have won the seat of government, right? That may be a non-issue, but there's a debate going on out there for whatever it's worth. So the PPP was able to return to power after 23 years in the so-called political wilderness, which I don't agree with. Because political wilderness means that you're out there doing nothing.
Nothing, right? I agree.
But during the 23 years, the PPP was working, right? Doing its political work and its international work. There's no political party in the Caribbean that has been in the so-called political wilderness for 23 years and was able to return to power with the kind of stigma that the PPP had.
Well,
It was communist, Jagan was a Marxist, and all those things, okay?
Very salient.
Now, the PPP was able to astute political parliamentary maneuvering to return the government in the shortest possible time from 2015 to 2020. So I am arguing from my perspective,
Yes.
that the PPP is unique in the sense that having gone through all those difficulties, today it's a governing party. But there's still attacks, even though the PPP was established 73 years ago, and even Jagan was there 73 years ago, we're still under attack. PPP is still under attack. And the same old hackneyed arguments are being brought back today, but without any success. But I like to make this point coming back to the question of flexibility. I think this has what has resulted in the PPP being successful in the political arena. After the 73 elections, when the incumbents were shot and the army intervened in the elections, 1974, just a few months after, the PPP was able to articulate a policy of critical support for the Bonham administration, which was deemed a dictatorship. Now, when the PPP articulated the view of critical support, there was a view that the Bonham administration was pursuing anti-imperialist policies. And there's a whole book that was written by the Central Committee of the party that was created to justify why it took the position of greater support. And I want to make this point, which is important to say in this context we're living in now, that I remember at a meeting at Freedom House where Dr. Jagan invited a whole set of Indian businessmen and leaders of the Indian community at the time. I won't call names, but they all came to a meeting at Freedom House where Dr. Jagan explained this concept of critical support. Because he was coming under severe criticism and attack for selling out Indian people. How could you go and have critical support just a few months after, or a year or so after, Bonham had rigged the election in 73 and the army had been in the election in 73? Now, critical support, in my view, was useful for the time, but that reflected the flexibility of the party. And then later on came the National Patriotic Front and National Front government. Again, within the context of a dictatorship. So I'm arguing that this policy or this tactic of being flexible but firm, because it was the firmness that broke down the talks that were taking place during the period of critical support, right? But this tactic of being flexible and Jagan being able to interrelate his political adversaries, notwithstanding the chasm between the two, was something that helped to maintain the efficacy of the People's Progressive Party today.
Good point. Then I don't know if you can touch a little on this point, because I know it's something that a lot of guys have some strong views on. and that was the introduction of proportional representation in Guyana, which some people felt that was responsible for the PPP losing the 1964 election. And some even felt that Dr. Jagan may have underestimated the guile, as it were, of the British, and in agreeing to the proportional representation method of elections in 64. Do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Okay, a combination of things. After the 1953 elections, the British tried to rig elections against the PPP. In 57, by manipulating the boundaries, they made the whole of the country, including Kanchi, one seat. And that was Dr. Jagan's seat that he fought. And where the PNC and so forth, they felt that was strong, they made it smaller. And that is why the amount of votes that Dr. Jagan got in 1957 in his constituency was more than all the opposition put together at the time. And in 1961, when they failed, they manipulated the seats even more. For instance, in Georgetown, it was so blatant because they thought that PPP would have won La Penitence, all based on La Penitence seat. So they tied it on to Lodge, which was not contiguous to the area. But they failed. So having failed that, they were looking at ways of how they could defeat the PPP. The first proposal for proportional representation came from the head of Booker's at the time. He was a senator, a nominated member of the Senate, Anthony Tasker. He was the one who first raised the idea. But the idea didn't catch on at the time because Britain didn't agree with it. Britain itself didn't have it. In fact, what is ironic is that British, when they introduced PR in British Guyana, because they said that PPP had more seats than they had votes, they were in the very same position. In fact, the Liberal Party of the United Kingdom had a big protest on a major article saying, why do you impose this in British Guyana? You don't want to do it here. But the British excuse of not doing it here is because it will create weak government. And there was an old argument too that PR created a Hitler in Germany. And that is why Germany changed their system. So you had this coming up. In 1962, when Trinidad was going towards their independence, it was raised as a system for Trinidad. And the British opposed it on the grounds that it would balkanize Trinidad. And Eric Williams agreed with them that it would balkanize Trinidad and it was not good for Trinidad. In fact, Eric Williams was viciously against the PR system that was imposed on British Guyana. And he was an independent country at the time. And he was saying that British Guyana should have the same constitution as Trinidad had. And in 1963, the Trinidad Parliament was going to debate the PR that was imposed on British Guyana, but the killing of Kennedy disrupted that debate and they never went back to the issue. So that the idea was clear to defeat the PPP, to use the PR, that was, but it was also to keep the races divided. Because under PR, under the system of PR, all over the world, people organize not on the basis of national issues, but on the basis of differences, ethnic issues, religious issues, different kinds of issues. You get in a lot of issues coming out in the world today that people are organizing around. Look at Israel. They had 5 elections in 2 years. So the British, in order to want to keep control of Guyana, wanted to have weak governments. And even though they wanted to get rid of the PPP, they wanted to ensure that they keep control of the situation by keeping coalition governments in the country. What they didn't recognize, or what they were forced to support, was bottom rigging of the elections because they didn't want the PPP in the government. Because after 1968 rigging of the elections, the PPP recognized that they had to, they took a stand on the side of the socialist war and socialism and so on and so forth. So they didn't want that. So my view is that even if you look at all the arguments in that time and all the literature that clearly says that PR keeps your country divided, keep you divided on the basis of differences and so on and so forth, and establishes weak governments, because most of the countries, if not all, most of the countries, not all, because we are not one, most of the countries where you have the PR system, you have coalition governments, and sometimes it's hell. In Suriname, they used to get big fights to form a government, and now they don't have the same kind of physical fight that they used to have. But it takes them at least 6 months to a year to form a government after every elections, because they have to bargain. So you're not bargaining on the basis of the national issue. You bargain when you will give me this ministry and I can take this ministry and that. So the general trust is lost in the kind of horse trading that takes place in this regard. So I think that we need, I think also another reason why they wanted to do that, because they recognized that the PPP was bridging the racial gap in the 60s. If you look in 1957, PNC won 3 seats. They barely won. Bonham himself barely won his own seat in Georgetown. And in 1961, the PPP won 4 seats, where the majority of the electorate were African Guyanese. So they recognized that if they give the PPP time, that it was going to bridge the racial gap that they had created, that the British.
And do you think we should go back to the constituency system?
Yes, I think that's the only thing that we could go back to. Otherwise, we will always suffer. We can end up here, particularly at this time, when you have huge corporations with revenues bigger than our GDP and got a strong interest in our politics. I believe that that a PR system gives them a possibility to create political parties and political divisions where they can very well be pulling the strings and determining what type of government the country has, and not necessarily the people determine.
And that brings us to the question of who benefits from the division, ethnically, racially, and otherwise in Guyana. Who are the major beneficiaries of maintaining such a system in our country? I think that's something we need to analyze some future point in time.
Yes, maybe we will dedicate a program to looking at the race issue in this country, race relations, and all kinds of allegations that are being made about the PPP being a racial party. But I want to come to this question that you had touched on a little, that the PPP was perhaps one of the most resilient party, if I may say so, having been kept out of power during the 53, 57 period, and won a landslide, being kept out for 23 years and winning election, and then a little of it in the 5-year period under the act. Now, what do you think is the reason, especially in the 1992 period, for the PPP to have been able to come back, make that big political comeback? And it's the first time, apart from the 1953 elections, correct me if I'm wrong, where from the 1961 elections, the PPP was able to win 50% and more of the votes. Because in the 60s, the PPP in 61, 64, the PPP never managed to go beyond the 48%. But the PPP in 1992, for the first time.
Just to put a caveat there. In 1961, the PPP contested 29 of the 35 seats. They didn't contest all the seats. So they didn't contest the whole country to see if they would have got 51%.
Okay.
In 1957 too, I don't think they contested some of the seats in the interior because money was the issue to raise money to go in the interior. They didn't have the money to go. So
in 64, you say?
61.
61.
61.
But the 92 events leading up to 92. You see, I remain convinced about the flexibility tactics of the PPP. During the period of 68 to 92, with the rigging of elections, I don't like to use the word force, but the PPP saw the need to engage with, you know, at one time the people were fighting the struggle alone for free and fair elections. Alone. Not that it wanted to do that, because it wanted political upmanship, because there was no one else who wanted to join with the PPP in this struggle for free and fair elections. But with patient and consistent work, that's why I mentioned that this whole question about being in the political wilderness is a Western concept that's not applicable to what was transpiring in Guyana. Because as we all know, you, I, and Donald, we know, as well as other commerce know, that Dr. Jagan and the PPP, its activists, its supporters, its soldiers on the ground, were always out there working among the people in the trade unions, in the farmers' organizations, in the non-governmental organizations, in the international community. So it's not that we were engaging in any sectarian, because if you engage in sectarian policies or politics, you will obviously end up in isolation. And in the wilderness, so to speak, wilderness means you're out there, but you don't have anybody to talk to or to engage in or to work with. But this was not the case with the PPP. During that period, the PPP worked patiently and consistently to build friends as well as allies. Some short term, some medium term, some long term. And it was assisted by its fraternal organizations like Guyana Agricultural Workers Union, the Rice Producers Association, the Guyana Agriculture Producers Association called GAPA, right? Our organization was created by Dr. Jagan called the Civil Liberties Action Council, a whole multiplicity. And this is what the party was very good at. Creating not umbrella or shell organizations, creating organizations in both form and content with people. So work was going on the ground. Now, that work eventually led to the creation of the Committee for the Defense of Democracy at the time of the referendum. And I myself got some good experiences around that period.
Both of you were very active in that period. I remember that.
Now, the CDD, as it was popularly called then, the acronym, brought together a host of individuals as well as political parties to fight against the referendum. We could talk more about that at another time. But that was where you found an alliance, for want of a better term, or a coalition of individuals and organizations to fight against this referendum. That eventually led to the creation of the Patriotic Coalition for Democracy, the PCD, again, with the PPP playing a major role. The flexibility of the PPP to work with its political adversaries on a common platform. Again, the PPP working with the Working People's Alliance. And we had experiences where we didn't agree with the WP on a number of issues, but the bottom line was the restoration of democracy. And that was the common platform that the PPP held to in order to achieve democracy in this country. So the electoral reforms came as a result of the work of the People's Progressive Party over the years, subsequently together with other political formations who stood on this common platform, and with eventually the introduction of the Carter Center that helped. Let me make this final point. There's some people in this country, when they talk about the struggle for free and fair election, they put a lot of emphasis on what happened outside. Carter Center, the diaspora, and so on. That is true. But we know
Main struggle was there.
that the main struggle was in this country. Thousands of people marching on the quarantine, on the Essequibo, on the East Coast, on the East Bank, in the small villages, demonstrations, strikes, picketing. This is where the struggle was. And I'm telling you that had it not been, if those external forces did not see the kind of movement and the mobilization that was taking place domestically, I doubt. Maybe I'm wrong. I
Let me
doubt.
put it in another
That's
way.
a fundamental
Put it in another way.
Yeah,
I think we could have probably, it would have probably taken longer,
Yeah.
but we would have won without the international support. And they helped to bring it closer. They made a contribution. We can't deny that they made a contribution.
No.
But I agree with Clement that some people would say that they say Carter brings me unfair elections, ignoring all the struggles, ignoring Jagan, Ramotar, and Bolanat, Parmenan, and all of the struggles, ignoring this
Bashir.
all of the Comrade Bashir who was shot and so forth. So I agree completely.
I think that's a fundamental point you made here,
Yeah.
Jonathan, and I think.
But also, there's another fundamental principle that the PPP always held on to, that you cannot have sustained social and economic progress without political democracy. And the PPP believed in that then and believes in it now, that you have, for us to get our people to work, to produce, that you have to have democracy. And because once the Bonham started to rig elections like in 1968, he started to increase the size of the state. A large amount of money began to go into the state. Ken Dance did a study which showed that 35, there was one military or paramilitary person for every 35 persons in our country. So that's a huge state apparatus they had to be building. And as more and more money went to the state, they went also destroy the economy because the bauxite industry, when it was nationalized, it could have been a very viable company, but the PNC, in order overemployed, double or triple the employment there, and eventually made it not an economic venture. And the same thing they did in sugar in many, many ways. So the economic conditions, I think, were beginning also to force people together. After the 1973 elections, you remember the PNC started first to talk about their first economic program was based on a neoliberal type of program, the Puerto Rican model. Then when that failed, I think also because of the lack of democracy. Then they started to talk about socialism and about cooperative socialism. And by the way, they talk about cooperative socialism because cooperatives are very, very successful in British Guyana in the 60s under the PPP. And your father was one of the leaders of the co-op movement in this country at the time. You had thousands of people built their houses in Rumbelt and many other places with co-ops and all of that there. So you had different kinds of co-op, and I believe that is why they adopted the term cooperative socialism to try to build on what was our history too. So people began to reject them. Workers started to come together. And I believe too that the common ownership of the sugar and the bauxite industry, the government owned them, I think was an important factor that helped to bring unity among the working people, because you had a common owner and things were getting bad, and it forced people to act together. The sugar workers supported bauxite workers strike, collected food to send up to them. And then the bauxite workers did the same thing. They marched, the OWP, this boy, Desmond Moffat, and Cedric, they marched to support Arnold Rampersad, so that the solidarity and the unity was being built in struggle against the dictatorship. And it was in that period that brought me up. In that foment, the conditions were really set properly when Rodney returned here and also took the struggle to even another level at the time.
Well, gentlemen, there's so much more we can say about the PPP, but we don't want to overburden this program with too many facts. But what we will do, a lot of things are happening internationally too. You mentioned the Ukraine war in Brazil, some very serious development.
I think it's important to look at the PPP through the prism of present day context. And I am of the view that the programs and policies of the original PPP, meaning PPP of the 50s, let me put it that way, the PPP of the 50s, with emphasis on housing. Donald made that point, the housing schemes and the cooperative that was set up. This present government from 92. Remember in 92, Cheddi bought the housing project from Venezuela.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, you still have one or two of those houses.
Right. The housing drive continues from then to now with a different administration or two different administrations. Am I correct? You have to give
something that
you have to give jacket.
Some things continue, right? But there's something that have changed too.
Okay, but let's look on the positive. The housing drive. Emphasis, majority of money from the budget going on social services, health and education, take the biggest chunk of the national budgets. Cheddi made that an important dimension of his economic policies at the time when the debt burden was under pressuring him. So the social services and the money going for the social services sector, see, is still reflective of what the PPP has been doing over the years, right? Good. So the human factor is a question which we always have to bear in mind, because you can't have the progress that we've been looking for since 1950. Of course, the working class and work group have changed over the years, different generations, but the demands basically are the same: clean water, electricity, housing, transportation,
education, social sector,
health. These demands are there. Of course, what is different now is that we got the money.
Yes, well, the money has helped to further advance that process of human development.
Help more.
And can help more.
Yeah.
So I agree with you that the PPP has always embraced what you call development with the human faces.
That's
some would have put in.
Yeah. Some people call it people
at the center of the development process.
Yeah.
So there's no question about that. And I would say any real development that has taken place in Guyana since the 50s has a stamp of the PPP. And the PPP is fundamentally a developmental party. And there's no question. Maybe in another program, we can talk some more on these issues.
The foreign policy,
that Donald raised. We'll look at some international issues too, with what's happening in Brazil. Maybe in our next program, we should focus a little on what's taking place. Because in Peru, you had a problem there with the leader was over.
The most important international issue is to try to prevent nuclear war.
So maybe we'll dedicate a program, maybe the next one, and on these issues. But I just want to say too that the Cheddi Jagan Research Center, the Red House, has brought out its recent edition of The Thinker, which is the volume 7, the 7th edition of The Thinker. And in this magazine, we deal with a lot of issues, local, international. We have perspectives from different people, cultural issues. And I will want to take this opportunity of this program to introduce The Thinker to all of you who are looking. And you can have copies right here from the center, the Cheddi Jagan Research Center. It's a very informative and sell at a relatively cheap price, just $1,000 for a copy. And there's also a lot of what was said here can be found in Dr. Jagan's book, The Western Trial. And I also want to encourage all of you who are watching who have not as yet get a copy of The Western Trial, read it. And it has a wealth of history that no other publication in this country has. The kind of the perspective on Guyana's development, political, social, economic, you name it. So with that, I want to thank our two presenters, former President Ramotar, former General Secretary Clement Rohee, I must also thank our technical operator, Shivash Prasad, for making this the technical aspects of this program possible. So, yours, thank you very much, and we look forward to you joining us again. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. We have gone past 1.5 hours, and we don't want to.